Hello and welcome to Wrestling and Everything Coast to Coast with your host, Buddy Sotello, and our special guest host, Mike Leno. Nobody else to introduce tonight, but that's okay. We have a very special show tonight, even though we gave a tribute to Bobby Eaton last week and also to Jody Hamilton. We've got all sorts of...
Ultimate tribute as a friend to all of those guys, including Dominic DeNucci. I just want to show, last time I was on, it was just 2 weeks ago. I took a week off last week to recharge, had on a kind of a gross blood and guts background intentionally because we were discussing Nick Cage and Jericho and violent pro wrestling. So I have a photo I took from the Olympic Auditorium, Jimmy Lennon Sr. standing there helping Neil Moskowitz cut the hair of Bull Ramus, Apache Bull Ramus. I just wanted to back up enough so you guys could see it. That was from a big, huge hair versus hair match. And that was underneath Fred Blassie with a losing effort against Dory Funk Jr. for the NWA Championship on one of those all-star cards. But tonight I wanted to really pay tribute and in a different way add some ribs and road trips discussing friends of mine, the Assassin #1, Jody Hamilton, Dominic DeNucci, who just passed a few days ago. That was heartbreaking, even though he was 90. And Bobby Eaton, way too young at 62. I was very close to. I'm going to Ginsburg. Our Evan Ginsburg wanted to take off. He's taken off until at least September. He's getting ready. He's working on the book that's coming out that he's been working hard on. We'll be promoting that, dragging him back on to promote it. But that should be coming out. So he won't be on for just a couple of weeks. But I do want to give out my email. So before we get into that, I'm going to do a news rant briefly and then do our tribute for basically the front of the show. I want to give out my email, WREA, my last name, LANO at AOL.com. I want to see what our listeners out there would like, because to differentiate ourselves from these zillion other wrestling podcasts, I mean, Evan Ginsburg and I, for like more than 2 decades, did a show, Legends Radio, until we just took he was then busy with the rest of the movie. But we had on, wrestling was always a part of it, but we had on movie, TV stars, stand-up comics, boxers, MMA athletes, people from other businesses. On one show, I had Judy Collins and Roberta Flack on together. On another, I had childhood icons Soupy Sales and Paul Winchell on together with me interviewing them. Evan brought on Grandmaster Flash. Another time we had Helen Hunt and Paul Reiser on talking about his...
Hey, I got the guy that was Sergeant Slaughter on The Young Rock to come on our show. That's got to count for something.
But I'm just saying, I'm talking about what we did with Legends Radio, which was the actual AM/FM, it wasn't just podcasting. And if anybody hasn't seen Sarah Silverman's hysterical intervention take on podcasts, she actually looked at a stat from I think it was Newsweek magazine that said 8 out of 10 Americans have their own podcast. She added to that saying, and the other two are discussing having one on or doing it together. But it was a podcast intervention where some guy would have a idiotic podcast on just discussing soups all by himself, some untrained guy talking soups. And she and a crew of white outfitted medical guys with the butterfly net would just take this guy back to the nut house. And they did that repeatedly. So to differentiate ourselves, why don't you email me? Actually, if you guys have comments, likes, dislikes, what you'd like to see more of, less of, what we want to involve you. I think that would be a good idea to involve you guys, because right now we can't, I don't even know any podcasts that are taking live calls. Well, there's some. I think there are some that are, we just can't do it yet. So in lieu of that, and I'll read anything, uncensor it. But let's get into the news. I do want to play a song I used to drive Bobby Eaton nuts with. We'd go from the Red Roof in Philly, not that far from Deptford, New Jersey. Actually, yeah, it wasn't that far from Deptford, New Jersey, which is Dennis Coraluzzo's home. But when we go to Dennis Coraluzzo shows or events or signings, and even when his evil arch enemy, Joel Goodhart, was running TWA, the precursor to ECW, and the Japanese mags would fly me out to Philly, Jersey to shoot that. Dennis would always insist on it. I stayed at the house. But when I would go with Bobby Eaton, who, like more traditional, Okay. Well, that was one of my favorite songs, and I would drive Bobby Eaton nuts. I want to get into some news before we do our tributes.
What was the name of the song? What was the name of the song again?
Girl from Ipanema Goes to Greenland. So it was a comedic take on the 60s bossa nova Brazilian.
Yeah, I know the song, The Girl from Ipanema. Yeah.
This one was very cool. And when a bunch of us went on Tyree Pride and Kevin Sullivan's Caribbean tours, I would bring mixtapes like a couple of years before that, before driving Bobby Eaton nuts. Like we're talking 83, 84, 85, I would take this song and then drop the mixtapes at all the clubs that we'd go to at night or the bars, etc. And people were starting to dance to it. So I later told all of the B-52s, the 4 surviving members, that this is what I did to help get your song over. One of the greatest dance songs ever. But tonight, Sunday, wherever you are, and so to not quote Jim Ross, but it's Sunday and you don't know what that means. So we're going to push Star's debut, the Star's cable channel of the show Heels. Stephen Amell, friend of Cody Rhodes, who you saw him get involved in some WWF stuff when he was I think it was a DC superhero Flash. Anyway, he's co-executive producer of this, I think showrunner. Arrow, I'm sorry. He was originally on the DC Comics show, TV show Arrow. And the Vikings, the NFL star Alexander Ludwig is the other guy in the leading role. About 2 brothers trying to live up to their dad's legacy, running an indie promotion called Duffy Wrestling League. It's supposed to be set in a small Georgia community, and it is quite the deal. And so I've seen a lot of headlines. New York Times and the Wall Street Journal had like near full page articles on this show. And some of the episodes, episode 8, the first one, Kayfabe, the second one's called The Dusty Finish, followed by Cheap Heat, cutting promos, Swerve, not Swerve.
Would you ever have thought, Mike, like when we were in the early 2000s and we were at APW, that like independent wrestling would get such a mainstream acceptance by...
No, because old days, we... First, really, the only guy to ever get on TV was Gorgeous George. He was on the Jack Benny show in the late 40s and 50s, particularly, obviously, the 50s when the radio...
Because it was so... Sometimes wrestlers would make it into movies and
much later on. Gorgeous George had his own movie, Alias the Champion. He employed a bunch of wrestlers, and there were some other ones like Mighty Joe Young that had the Super Swedish Angel and Mike Mazurki and a couple of... There was actually, I think, 4 or 5 total, playing strongmen, but they were pro wrestlers. Right. But I really wouldn't tell Andre the Giant was on the Johnny Carson show. He had a substitute host, but he was also on Mike Douglas. And that was in the mid...
$6 Million Man. He was big
later on. But I'm talking 74, 75 is when he did Tonight Show, and Mike Douglas, or $6 Million Man. And then I think he was on another, not T.J. Hooker, but something like that. But also, or The Incredible Hulk, too. And there was also a huge deal when Andre fought Chuck Wepner underneath Ali Inoki. But on the Ali Inoki, they had those 2 Wide World of Sport. And for those of us to see Fred Blassie and standing right next to Vern Gagne, I think it was when Ali fought Buddy Wolf, you know, they had him do these preliminaries. Obviously, later on came the Monsoon thing. But that was big. And then, of course, what Russ is referring to, Andre on those shows, Andre and Princess Bride. But, you know, you look at the latest issue of Sports Illustrated for September has like 3-4 pages on this indie promotion that is an all-inclusive. Let's see, what's it called here? It is not Heroes and Heels, but it's called, I'll read the thing. It's called, the title of the thing doesn't even refer to Ring of Honor, the promotion, but it says Ring of Honor, far from the bright lights and bloated mayhem of WWE, pro wrestling's soul and spirit are on full display at a VFW town hall in the rural South, the home of Georgia Independent Professional Wrestling. So that's the name of it, GIPW. You should go check it out. I think it's actually 6 pages long, the feature. So indies are there. Wrestling is everywhere. It's on every night of the week. I wish, well, and now we have Heels on the Stars cable channel on Sunday nights. I'm hoping soon, at some point this year, we get back AAA and CMLL on the weekends. But big news, of course, from the AAA show, Triple Mania show. I've shot a couple of those in Mexico City. I think that was last night, where Ric Flair made an appearance first, and he was seconding Andrade El Idolo. So that's Andrade, who was in WWE before they dropped parts of his name, the way they've done with so many, Cesaro and Rusev and so many other ones. They just dropped parts of the name. They've renamed Nikki Cross, all this stupidity. But anyway, so Andrade was supposed to be accompanied by Conan against Kenny Omega, who retained the AAA mega title, but told Conan he doesn't need his services. So instead, he brought who we call somebody more important than him, and it was Ric Flair. But because the night before on the new AEW Terrific Rampage show, in 1 hour, they do more and give more. Obviously each week is.
That's what I've been saying about wrestling for years now. And really on this show, it's a repeat thing that I'm always bringing up, that too much is not more, it's less in a lot of ways.
Well,
because of WWE shows.
Yeah, the whole second hour of Raw last week was like a repeat of the week before.
It is.
But AEW reviewed Friday nights, and it's going to be every Friday night, 10 p.m. Eastern time or Pacific too, right after 2 hours of SmackDown. SmackDown was a good show. They gave Shinsuke Nakamura the Intercontinental title for the second time. But Rampage, what I was saying, in an hour gave you way more than a bloated 3-hour Raw. So because Kenny Omega dropped the Impact 2 belts, that and the TNA belt all as one, to Christian Cage, being renamed that there, that AEW has control of his booking and told AAA he was actually supposed to drop the title to Andrade, who was also in AEW, but is able to work AAA shows, etc., and other indies in Mexico. They didn't want him losing and dropping titles 2 nights in a row, so they pulled that clause there. So also accompanying Ric Flair, and she was advertised on the Charlotte, North Carolina WWE SmackDown and Raw Super Show, but she did not show up for that because instead, at the same time the other night, she was with Flair in Mexico City at that, because of course her longtime boyfriend is Andrade. So is she going to be bolting from like Ric Flair did to AEW? I mean, all signs are pointing. So the rumor mill, allegedly, all that stuff is that Flair's going to go to AEW now. So it's looking like 96, 97 WCW versus WWF all over again. And on that same Triple Mania great show, Deonna Purrazzo from Impact also won the AAA Reina de Reinas, Queen of Queens title. That's their female world championship, similar to Kenny Omega. So that's a big deal now. She's like Omega. I mean, for a while there, until last Friday, he had 3 companies' belts, but now he has 2. She has 2. And of course, we're waiting for CM Punk and Bryan Danielson, formerly Daniel Bryan, to go to AEW. So,
yeah, and so my question to you, Mike, is: do you think that the WWE is in a vulnerable enough state for the veritable slingshot of AEW to knock down the Goliath of the WWE finally?
Well, they're just in sort of their own alternative universe, WWE. They have that Nick Khan that was hired, fairly recently, and people are blaming him. I'm not, it all comes down to what Vince wants. Vince is the ultimate arbitrator and boss. But people are blaming Nick Khan for all of these releases, almost like every other week, and most recently, quite a bit of NXT talent being let go, which was horrific. Leon Ruff and some of the other big stars, but and Mercedes Martinez, who was huge, very experienced female wrestlers, worked well over 20 years, and is well respected globally. I mean, and that's like sending the way. I don't recall in the WCW versus WWF days of the mid to late 90s where WWF was actively releasing, best endeavoring people the way they are now. At the same time, talent is leaving of their own volition, like Flair, Mark Henry.
Braun Strowman.
Well, he's not in AEW. I'm saying people that directly switched from WWE.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah. But, I mean, people leaving of their own volition or people that said they were
Yeah.
going to be in the WWE for life.
Yeah,
you know.
as this Tundas kid who was Bray Wyatt. That's
Bray Wyatt, yeah, absolutely.
very
Absolutely.
creative guy. And also on the Rampage show last Friday, AEW, that follows the 2 hours of SmackDown. They're not going head to head, thankfully, so we're not having another Wednesday situation. Sami Guevara, that was a whole shoot where when Miro beat Fuego del Sol to his TNT title, Sami was talking to Tony Khan, and then presenting Fuego del Sol, his best friend from the indie circuit. A total shoot, an actual contest. Because Fuego del Sol, the gimmick steps were he had to beat Miro for the title, and then he would get a contract after he's been doing primarily enhancement jobs for AEW the past year on Dark and Elevation, etc. So that was a nice moment. So you have all this feel-good stuff. As I said on the last show I was on, Tony Khan is a promoter who has a lot of heart, who grew up as a fan and is like the anti-Vince, many people call him, because he's giving the people what they want, and that's what he likes. And there's unlimited resources there. So with the Nick Khan stuff in WWE, the allegations or the rumor mill is that they're trying to improve their bottom line, maybe for a potential sale or whatever. You recall they sold their WWE network to their partners at NBC, the Peacock streaming service, and that it's almost impossible to watch a lot of the content you want from WWE on Peacock because they have so much other stuff. They have everything else, sports and all the NBC programs, and it's very frustrating. So that is my rant for tonight. And Russ, any other comments on the week that we just had? So we record this on Sundays, and then you get it up, within hours, what have you. But so I'm going to get into
the WWE is girding itself for the start of football season, because that's when all other eyes start, especially Monday night. I think a lot of viewers are going to be off of wrestling to watch the WWE, to watch the NFL. So you're going to see a drop in viewership. And as baseball heads into the playoffs, the cities that have the teams that are in the playoffs, they're going to be watching a lot of that intensely and not watching as much wrestling. So I know that you can record stuff.
That hurts WWE ratings, but it also has affected AEW when they had to bump and move around because of the NBA playoffs, etc. on TNT. And
exactly.
In WWE, we just saw that they had to put NXT on Sci-Fi during the Olympics, and the ratings, nosedive down to like 800,000, where they should be up higher. Those are the two best shows, I say, hands down, of the week, just amongst the bigs. AEW Dynamite Wednesdays, Tuesday night WWE NXT. I know we might be seeing a new NXT after this. I mean, if NXT were to lose Adam Cole to AEW, I mean, it's almost, in my opinion, over. If they're getting all of these guys and more, if they're getting Bryan Danielson, and that's pretty much a definite now, as well as CM Punk when they go to the Chicago Center venue. So when we get into now, so we're not rushing, the first of the three that passed. So we're paying tribute to Assassin Jody Hamilton. He was Assassin #1. But also beautiful Bobby Eaton of the Midnight Express and more, and Dominic DeNucci, boy, what a legend at age 90. All three great Hall of Famer legends. But
so which one do you want to talk about first?
Well, I want to talk about Jody Hamilton, a promoter. Well, first a wrestler, was great bolo. He had this tremendous career before becoming an assassin with many partners, but his first and best partner, Tom Renesto, and then we'll get into the others. But Jody Hamilton created the forerunner to the Power Plant, Deep South Wrestling, which around 2005 was a farm system for WWE, and helped create what they have now as their developmental. All of that came from his Deep South promotion when he was running as an affiliate of the WWE. We lost him on August 3rd after he went into hospice care as his health had gone downhill. But he was one of those guys, he and Tom Renesto in particular, but even later on when Renesto retired around 78 and I think his last booking job, or one of them, was helping kill our territory in Los Angeles. He was like our last booker. And prior to that, in Atlanta, he had sort of jumped from the NWA Paul Jones, the promoter, not the wrestler booker, to allegedly go help Ann Gunkel, the widow of Ray Gunkel, who was taking on the entire NWA Atlanta and Georgia office. For 2 years, as I've said before, almost 2 years, she outdrew many times the bigger office that was head booked by Bill Watts, a genius, and others in addition to him, including for a time Tom Renesto, but then he came over like the Trojan horse and eventually helped sink. Many blame him for sinking Ann Gunkel's promotion. But when he came to Los Angeles after first Louis Tilley and later Leo Garibaldi of the father and son Garibaldi tag team, and Leo Garibaldi was a genius. Louis Tilley, not so good as a booker prior to him in 74 and 75. And then Tom Renesto. But Tom Renesto and Jody Hamilton as the Assassins, and their peak period was about 61, 62 through 72, although obviously Assassin Jody Hamilton, who we just lost, went on well beyond that. But they were heels who, like Bockwinkel later, and he saw him in Georgia, and he saw him in LA when they brought their feud with the Kentuckians there in 62 and 63. But these heels, the Assassins, were not yelling and screaming heels. They were quiet. They were educated.
That's what I loved about
like
them. That's what I absolutely love. And I said last week, you weren't here, but last week I said that what was really great about guys like the Assassin and the Spoiler and the Destroyer, Dick Beyer, is that they were mass wrestlers, but they weren't lucha wrestlers. And believe me, I have all the respect in the world for lucha wrestling and what the mass means.
Didn't start with lucha.
No.
Mass Marvel, the original Mass Marvel was like before lucha. Lucha then took from American Pro Wrestling, obviously came first. Well, not really, because we can derive the lineage to 1860s France and 1880s France.
That's what I remember.
And carny shows and all of that, but it really was more an Americanized phenomenon. And then when Ricky Dozan and some of the female tours in Japan in the 50s, but Ricky Dozan obviously late 50s, 60s, they created, what's arguably the greatest pro wrestling ever since in Japan. I believe that. But lucha, CMLL is well over 80 years now as a promotion, the world's oldest promotion. So, but the American mass guy is far different than the, those in Mexico. Obviously, the original Santo, Blue Demon, Mil Máscaras, Cien Caras, El Psicodélico, his brothers, and so many others. Reality.
Yeah, no, but I've always, and you know me, I've always loved the old school style American mass wrestler. You know that's I converted Mark Smith from his football gimmick, where he was getting no pop, to being Super Destroyer 2000, and he wore the mask, and he changed his character to be so much more heel based on the fact that he had a mask and quote unquote nobody knew who he was, and we kayfabed it, and said Mark Smith went back to Colorado, and here's my new bodyguard, and he played the role so perfectly, where he was just the big tough side of beef, and I was the yappy, annoying mouthpiece, much like the way we see what Brock Lesnar was doing with Paul Heyman for so long, and I miss that. That's something that that is not in wrestling. I mean, maybe the closest thing you have is the Luchasaurus. That's probably the closest thing you have to the.
Ray Jr. is he's kind of now pretty much an Americanized, because he wrestles here more, always exclusively with WWE, but he spent the majority of his career in the States. He is a sort of, I could draw some parallelisms to Mr. Wrestling 1, which was Tim Woods, and Mr. Wrestling 2, which was Rubberman Johnny Walker, as classic United States, primarily baby faces. The sensational intelligent destroyer, Dick Beyer, was amateur pro. I forgot one thing I want to mention in my news rant was on Rampage. we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. It was only show one, but it seemed like poor Excalibur, the main host, the lead guy, had to pitch very quickly. It was just too much, and it seemed stressful to try to throw to talented talkers, Chris Jericho and Taz. But then to have a fourth guy in the booth, Mark Henry's, from Texas. He's a bit of a slow talker. I would just move him to strictly doing the interviews and maybe special other things. Just have a 3-person booth. You got to have a 4-person booth. Add a female. Maybe while she's recuperating from her wrist break, Dr. Britt Baker. I mean, gosh, they've got a lot of female talkers, but Britt Baker is probably one of the best on the planet right now. Have her in that booth. 4 people, it's not as tight a show as it should be from just that standpoint. But that's a minor thing, just calling out on the announcement.
So just tell me, did you meet Jody Hamilton in person? And if so, what was it like?
Many times. I just wanted to say he was born in 1938 in St. Joseph, Missouri, which was, of course, a Gus Karras. That was sort of an offshoot. He was the smaller venue promoter later on to Bob Geigel for Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, Kansas, and all of that. But Jody Hamilton, I didn't know until he told me he was the younger brother of Larry Hamilton and Missouri Mahler. And he followed Missouri Mahler, his brother, into pro graps in '56. Missouri Mahler was I think the very first pro wrestler to ever run for an office in the United States. He did that when he was wrestling for Eddie Graham in Florida, ran for state senate or something like that, well before anybody else would do it, obviously well before Jesse Ventura. But Jody Hamilton, I didn't get to see him, sadly, the early days, because when they would come into Los Angeles, and of course they wrestled everywhere. They wrestled in Japan, and all over the Southeast, etc. But they not only feuded with the Kentuckians, which was like a Fred Kohler, Vince McMahon Sr. Goldust Trio team in the late 50s, 60s, but they also wrestled Warren Bockwinkel and his young son, fresh out of UCLA. Tricky Nick Bockwinkel was what he was called back then, like around '63. So the Assassins met them. They actually had a heel-heel match with the Kangaroos, with Wild Red Berry as their manager. Amazing stuff. And then, of course, other teams like Bobo Brazil and Bearcat Wright, the Jackie Robinsons of wrestling amongst them. There were others.
Masked tag team of old school wrestlers where both guys are just non-characters, but they're just big, tough guys. That's something that wrestling, I'm sorry, needs to bring back. And I've tried my hardest to bring it back when I was a manager.
Well, we had remember Georgia Championship Wrestling, late '70s, early '80s. There was a mass superstar, Bill Eadie, in perhaps his best incarnation, and then they paired him
with Scott Irwin, right, as the Super Destroyer.
It had been Scott Irwin, and then the Irwin brothers, of course, I think, with and without mask in Fritz's territory in Dallas. But there was a tag team. I don't think it was Don Jardine, the masked spoiler, unless he was working another gimmick, teaming with Bill Eadie as masked superstar. But they had these two
couple tough guys.
It was Irwin though, but they were kick-ass heels. And this was a guy who told me, and Jody Hamilton told me, that Bill Eadie really learned and absorbed like a sponge from Jody Hamilton, because he gave those great promos. Decades-long feud with Dusty Rhodes all over Florida and Georgia. And it was a quiet, menacing heel, like we've been talking. And of course, Bill Eadie took that, and it's a very believable technique. Nick Bockwinkel took it, because during the summers and sometimes even during the winters when it was too cold in the AWA, he and Ray Stevens would go in as AWA World Tag Champs and wrestle for a couple of weeks in Atlanta. And that's when, of course, Jody Hamilton was backstage, but sometimes as a performer as well. And he was tough. He was a menacing guy, but a real sweetheart, super nice guy. I did not play any new age music or anything or punk rock to aggravate Jody Hamilton ever. I was never in a car with him, but was with him backstage at shows. He was there on a card. The first time I met him was at Christmas 1974. It was either 73, but I'm pretty sure it was 74. At the Atlanta City Auditorium, the primary building before the Omni, whereas on top, I mentioned this before, Fred Blassie refusing to sell for a heel, Cowboy Bill Watts. lastly only there at Christmas to visit relatives that particular Christmas. Loaded stack card. Ron Fuller, Tiemann as a babyface with less stature, and Bob Armstrong. That was on a six-man that night. But Jody Hamilton is the masked assassin. I think he had it was a double mask. It wasn't a mask versus match or anything, but with Tim Woods, the original Mr. Wrestling amateur great. So, and Jody Hamilton would mention and talk about Gus Karras, who he liked a lot better than Bob Geigel, like working his towns better, which was smaller than the main ones. He headlined, or Jody was at age 19, the youngest wrestler in history, as he loved to say, to ever co-headline Madison Square Garden, when he and his brother, Missouri Mahler, fought Antonino Rock and Miguel Perez. They were the great Puerto Rican connection in May of 1958. And the brothers were billed as being out of Savannah, Georgia, at the time of civil unrest. So to beat some Hispanic wrestlers at spot shows around New York prior to that, there was a lot of riots going on. And there's so much to talk about his history, even his bolo in the Mid-Atlantic and the bolo punch, that's where that came from, roaring back. And sometimes he would be assassin in other territories, Florida, Georgia, and then go back to Mid-Atlantic on occasion to help out there. They were all cross-promoting, but he'd work as the masked bolo. He had quite a few tours for Japan and Australia even, and just, I think most people think of him in the power plant days with Buddy Lee Parker, and then later on Deep South. But this guy was so incredible. I urge everybody with Jody Hamilton to go back and look at some of the promos, the classic. Go back and just for the Dusty Rhodes stuff, promo versus promo, or when he was teaming and he turned on Ole turned on Dusty in the cage, and Jody Hamilton and Ole worked Dusty over. But just look at some of those programs. Even Ole Anderson took from that style too. Didn't have to yell, scream, just incredible stuff. And
so let's move on to.
I want to move on to Dominic DeNucci.
Dominic DeNucci, okay.
DeNucci was a main eventer all over the place. And Russ will appreciate this. He did have, I think, 67, 68, part of 69. He came in and did quite a few shots for Roy Shire at the Cow Palace. Matches, glass, in different six-mans with teams made up of glass. He had Patterson, Ray Stevens. He worked some with Missing Link, his very good friend Hero Corpo as a team. But he was born Dominic Nucciarone, January 23rd, 1932, in I think it was for Solone, Italy. That was a province in Campo Basso. And he came to Canada from Frosinone in 1955 when he was only 19 and a half. The family settled in Montreal where his great uncle lived. And he was working out at the Palais National. Got quite a few guys who became friends. They were amateur wrestlers. There was pros there like Maurice Vachon, who wasn't he a silver medalist in the Olympics? But Maurice, Mad Dog Vachon, would come in and work out. And he, and particularly Yvon Robert Sr. and Tony Lanza, the photographer, approached Dominic DeNucci, who was really tall. He was like over 6'5", without entering pro wrestling. And Tony Lanza, who was a wrestler before he was this world-famous photographer, and I had some lessons with Tony Lanza as well as obviously Theo Eric, but he was the one that broke him in. It's wrestler, photographer, probably the greatest wrestling photographer who ever lived. With respect to George Napolitano, my compadre. But Nucci started wrestling around Montreal well before all his history in Toronto, where he met Bruno Sammartino. But he initially, you'll love this, Russ, he worked as a heel, the masked marvel of all things, one of about a jillion masked marvels. So he wrestles as a heel masked marvel under a hood, 1959, early 60s. But then he moved to Detroit, where they paired him up with the original or first Dino Bravo, and he was named, Dominic Bravo. So there was quite an Italian ethnic aisle in Detroit. They got over great. His legit, I'm looking over notes here, his legit height was 6'3", about 240 pounds at worst, he said. And he also had stints. He wrestled in Calgary for Stu Hart. Mentioned San Francisco for Shire. LA just a couple of times, not that much. He had 9 trips before he and Bruno started tag teaming over in Japan, but 9 trips on his own as a singles in Japan. Long run in Australia with guys like Stevens and Pepper Gomez and Kenji Shibuya and Bob Ellis before the Mark Lewin, Jim Barnett days. And they would call him the master of the airplane spin. That was his finisher.
You don't see the airplane spin that much. You have more or less have the giant swing by Cesaro, and that's pretty much all that resembles that move. It's an effective move. It's a little corny, but I guess the last person I think who did it was Eugene. Was the wrestler.
The talent, boy, was he ruined. What a shame, because that guy was just so packed with talent. But I remember Dominic said that he actually really enjoyed, not because of Roy Shire, who he didn't always care for, but he loved all the boys who were there at the time. And this is a quote from him, that wrestling in San Francisco was a early highlight of his career. And I think the best thing for me was when I was in San Francisco. That was the first one when I got to beat Ray Stevens for the U.S. Championship. That was the big title there. That to me at the time was very exciting because I was still young, Dominic said. And he did respect Shire. He called him one of the greatest promoters and payday guys and minds in the business. He just was a little unhappy about some other aspects. Roy could be a screamer and that sort of thing too. But here's a quote from him. Roy was a tough son of a bitch to do business with, but he paid good. He was paying the preliminary guys at the Cow Palace $500. If you weren't working and you stayed home, you got paid. The local guys, even the local guys were called DeNucci. Roy Shire, a lot of guys didn't like him, but you didn't have to like him. Just do what you had to do, and you drew the money, and you made money. And in Australia, he eventually was part of the Jim Barnett-led World Championship Wrestling crew in ERA. That's not affiliated with the Georgia or Turner World Championship Wrestling. He became a huge national star, starting in the golden era, or for him it was 64 through 78. And one of the most popular wrestlers ever to campaign in Australia was what Ed Locke, at the time, a longtime writer, wrote about him. But he had these great runs, not just in Australia and all over the U.S., but particularly for Pedro Martinez in Buffalo, and Pedro Martinez co-promoting with Johnny Powers as his booker throughout Ohio. Lots of shows at Cobo for the Sheik when the Sheik took over with wife Joyce there. That whole Michigan with parts of Ohio territory. That was big claim to fame. Claim to fame. He had mains with the Sheik in Detroit at Cobo, some of the smaller venues, and then of course at Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto, where that was one of his favorite places too. He told me personally he loved seeing his pals like Chris Tolis, John Tolis' brother, and so many other guys there, the undercard guys. And I think he even had a co-ownership of some condos in the Toronto area with Johnny Powers. But
now the picture that we have up is him with Bobby Heenan, right?
Yeah. Let's see. From left to right, it's Reggie Parks, Bill Anderson, Nick Bockwinkel, who was then our great CAC president, Bobby Heenan. There is Dominic. I can't. Let's see if I can blow it up. Tolis has got his head behind Nick Bockwinkel and Bobby Heenan, and I think that is Tough Tony Bourne on the far right. You just see his glasses, and he's in profile there. But throw up the Jody Hamilton. Did we throw up that picture of Jody Hamilton?
Yeah, that was up for a little while before when we were.
I can't always see, guys, everything that's up here. But Dominic, another one of his close friends, obviously Bruno was his very closest friend. And I really got to know Dominic, many places. I remember being with him in Tri-WF when we first took pictures of Dominic with Victor Rivera after they won the Tri-WF tag titles. I believe it was from the Valiants, because they sent the Valiants to the AWA. And I've talked about that experience on the show because I rode with them from Kennedy Airport to Peoria, Illinois was where they debuted for the AWA, not Chicago. But Dominic then got really upset because Victor Rivera, so this was in 1975, Victor Rivera jumped ship to Eddie Einhorn's IWA group that had Mascaras as the ultimate champ, and it was packed with talent. But they were taking on both the NWA and Vince Sr.'s Tri-WF. And Victor Rivera, like Dino Bravo and some others, didn't really jump ship, but they were Vince Sr. staples, Ernie Ladd, Bulldog Brower, and some other guys were already there. Then, as tag, it was just unheard of. Victor Rivera was tag champs with Dominic DeNucci, and then a couple of weeks later jumped ship over to Einhorn's group. So Vince kind of scrambles, and he just plucked one of his undercard guys, who was a global respected wrestler everywhere, Irish Pat Barrett. So like weeks after shooting Rivera standing there with Dominic DeNucci holding the tag straps backstage, I'm at Madison Square Garden, and now it's Pat Barrett and Dominic. You know, I asked Dominic, can you pose with Pat exactly the same way you did with Victor? And he was like cussing out Victor, calling him a turncoat for leaving Vince in his time of need. And it was kind of a shocker. Victor Rivera did not last that long. I mean, the very first outdoor Roosevelt Stadium show, another guy who was plucked from Vince, Ivan Koloff, quit that night, you know, his biggest night. He's at the first of 3 outdoor Roosevelt Stadium shows in New Jersey. And Ivan did not like the payoff that he was given by Pedro Martinez, not Eddie Einhorn. Eddie Einhorn told me when I had him on the show with Evan, the Legends show about 20 years ago, that he had no idea that Pedro Martinez screwed Ivan Koloff in the main event against Mil Mascaras in pouring rain, given a 4.5-star fantastic match. Screwed him on his payday. Koloff quit that night. Vince Sr. rehired him quickly soon after. Ernie Ladd was to come over later. Dino Bravo was. And Victor Rivera, I guess a little bit after that. But the feud was there, and Vince Sr. was furious, absolutely furious at Victor Rivera for that. So when Pat Barrett came to a Cauliflower Alley reunion, Dominic, used to come about every third one. I had them posed together, holding my photo of them together from 1975, maybe 30 years later. So Dominic, just a very sweet gentleman. And that brings me up to about 20 years ago. Bruno hired me. And Bruno was a guy I talked to and known since the 70s. And he used to call me, particularly from about 88 on, every Sunday almost. But in the 90s, he wanted to hear how Vince was losing ratings and pay-per-view buy rates and stuff, after the Ring Boy scandal and all that other stuff was going on, the steroid mess. And he was no longer part of it, of Tri-WF. Actually, he said he was only brought back, Vince Jr. brought him back with the carrot that he would put and promote David Sammartino on TV if Bruno would stick around against his will and come out with him. Because when Bruno accompanied his son, he was the one getting the pops. It wasn't David, who was talented in his own right. But
right. Yeah, no, he was definitely carrying on the coattails of his.
Yeah, it was overshadowed by his dad. But no, he was. That's why David Sammartino, not that long after he started, he was teamed with Larry Zbyszko for Vince Sr. But then he went to Georgia Championship Wrestling, like 79, 80, 81, that somewhere in there, I think 80, 81, and was trying to strike out on his own and be totally away from his dad and not be in his, shadow. And you have to give credit to him for that. He's a good kid.
It was an era of gimmick wrestling. And so, it was a time where if you didn't have a character, if you didn't have some kind of thing that you could impress the crowd with to get the crowd over, you weren't going to succeed. And unfortunately, he took too much after his dad's, bread and butter type wrestling that I know everybody from yesteryear loves, but didn't fit with the times of when wrestling was moving into that more gadgety sort of gimmicky.
That actually came about a little bit later when they really started doing the Skinners and the Widowmakers and all that stuff. I want to get to Bill Eadie, but let me just tell this story quickly. So Bruno hires me we were going to do 9 DVD series at that point. This was, again, 20 years ago. He flies me out to New York. I was to be the interviewer for all of these 9 documentaries, and I had to come up with the concepts. But one of them was me interviewing Bruno and Dominic DeNucci about their outside the U.S. travel. So it was called Ribs and Road Stories, them going to South America, Japan, obviously, all their time in Toronto where they first met, which was the stuff of legend. They became absolute best friends. But while there, when we had wrapped the shooting of these 9 DVDs, which I ended up post-producing, Bruno's Legends series, it was basically me just interviewing like Bruno and Pedro talking about their Shea Stadium babyface match from '72, etc. And I'll talk about this in future shows. If anybody wants to hear about them, let us know at that email I gave out. But so I got the invite to come to Tony Delano's, a fundraiser at the same time in New York City at a swanky club. So some of the people I had in there, I actually had for a Bruno as chair of a group of old school legends with Dominic, with Morales, with Ivan Koloff, Billy Graham, Backlund, Sean Stasiak representing his dad, discussing the state of the business at that time I had Scotty Levy, Raven, sharing a bunch of, current modern day people. It was modern day, it was kind of fudging it a bit, but I had Missy Hyatt and Francine from ECW, current MLW promoter, longtime friend Court Bauer, Christopher Daniels, SATs, Matt Stryker, who the wrestler announcer. But so I dragged Missy, Francine, Scotty Levy, and Sean Stasiak, and Dominic drove. He had a huge SUV, and that song I did play, that D-52 song, I put in a DVD of it to drive him nuts a little bit. But I took pictures of him outside the club before we went into this Pro Wrestling Hall of Fame fundraiser where Missy and Francine set records for donations. They were donating autographs and Polaroids. So they actually, up to that point, set the record for money garnered in a single fundraiser. But outside the club, I took pictures of Dominic looking like James Bond. He had on a very sharp suit with Missy and Francine, and I'll try to bring those photos aboard in a couple of weeks. I sent them out to all the magazines I work for, and I work for all that we have left around the world, including Shukan Pro. But that is kind of how I like remembering Dominic, this quiet gentleman. And Brittany Brown, female lady wrestler, longtime friend of the show, all of our shows, said that when she met him, he treated her like an equal, not like a female wrestler, but just like as a wrestler equal, didn't hit on her. So she said to tell you guys that what a respected, beloved gentleman he was, class guy away from wrestling, besides totally beloved legend, like our next guy, Bobby Eaton, who was, I can't say enough good things about beautiful Bobby Eaton, just a wonderful human being, probably in the opinion of many of us, the greatest underrated wrestler of all time. Good, you put his picture up there. And I just have so many fond memories of Bobby Eaton. Greatest tag team of all time, I have to say, Midnight Express with Jim Cornette, whether it was the Dennis Condrey version with Bobby Eaton or the Stan Lane one.
And that is a question from last week. Which one did you prefer?
I kind of like the original Dennis Condrey one, but I loved, I think it was 1990, was it when Heyman came in there and he brought in, I forget who he teamed, but he had the original Midnight Express. So that was when Lane and Eaton were teaming, but they're taking on Dennis Condrey, and I forget that guy that worked with Buddy Rose in the AWA. I think he was part of that original. So it was
Doug Summers.
Summers. I believe, I could be wrong, so email us in if I screw that up.
I think it's Doug Summers.
Yeah, Heyman came in with the original, he called it the original Midnight Express as heels to take on, and they turned to babyface. Jim Cornette managing, Eaton and Stan Lane, Sweet Stan Lane, and man, the reaction when the Midnights, so hated for years in the NWA, turned face, it was out of this world. Obviously, they turned heel on Armstrong and Tracy Smothers a bit later, but that was fantastic. And then to see Cornette and Heyman, slugging each other, cat fighting each other, whatever you want to call it, was just incredible. The heat off the charts. Such a magic period. But Bobby Eaton, a lot of us remember him early on in Tennessee dating Bill Dundee's daughter, who I think became his beloved wife. We lost her. That's the telling thing and the heartbreak of this story is his wife died a month before he died. And he'd had some health issues. I think the first heart attack, like 15 years ago. Just, none of us wanted to hear or see anything negative happen because Bobby Eaton was the guy who would pack extra supplies, food, bottled water, things you might need, wrist tape, finger tape, for the obvious, other things, extra set of tights, and more. If anybody in the locker room didn't, forgot to bring something or needed something, he was that caring of his fellow human beings. But I remember at the Tom Robinson benefit in 91, I think it was around August of 1991, rather, I'd just come back from two huge long trips in Japan. And Dennis Corluzzo was working with his arch enemy, the number 2 guy to Joel Goodhart and Todd Gordon, to promote this 2-day benefit. And everybody in the world was there. And the night before at Corluzzo's house, we're watching all night long till 6 a.m. With Jerry the King Lawler, with Cornette, Eddie Gilbert, Mick Foley, and a few others, obviously Eaton. We're watching Tiger Mask, Dynamite Kid, all these great tapes from Japan. But when we get to the venue, RF, and that stands for Rob Feinstein, RF Video. But at the time, before he cleaned up his act and then, first helped create, I think then he was doing the shoot tapes when he had to stop dubbing other people's content, and then, created his own finally, the shoot tapes, and then Ring of Honor co-created that, I think, with Gabe Sapolsky. But Cornette was hot at RF, Mr. RF, backstage at this thing, night 1, because actually, you know what? This was from a couple of years later when Smoky Mountain was going. So I think it was 92, but it was also with all those same guys. Those were all Coraluzzo favorites, Eddie Gilbert and Chris Candido and Tammy, along with Terry Funk, Lawler, and the Midnights and Corny and Steve Kern too. And so Cornette, starts getting into RF for dubbing his Smoky Mountain stuff. Like he was taping and selling commercial tapes, allegedly, his TV and stuff. And then Bobby Eaton, I think, for the one and only time in his life, I think didn't do anything, but threatened to kick the shit out of RF. And I think Corny said something about, like, we're going to hang you upside down, let all the money fall out of your pockets. And RF promised never to do that again. I think he held true to that promise. But that was the only time I saw Bobby Eaton really pretend to be a heel in like real life.
And when you kept playing that B-52 song, I'm sure.
He didn't mind it. I think it finally grew on him. That was not his type of music. But Bobby Eaton, so many things. Only 62, way too young for us to have lost a guy who made everybody else look good. And his sister Debbie was the one that broke the news. His daughter Taryn found him. And the Alabama Slam. He was indeed a true native of Huntsville, Alabama. He was born August 14th of 1958. And he started putting up the ring in Nick Goulas's Tennessee promotion when he was just, I don't even know, he turned 13, in cities as part of the overall territory, Huntsville, Florence, Birmingham. And then he started wrestling with a friend of his, and they were just doing, backyard wrestling at the time, and then kind of self-taught themselves before some of the wrestlers, I think Tojo Yamamoto and Gypsy Joe, the original real Gypsy Joe initially, and then he was hooked after the training. Man,
in the picture you have here, what belt does he have? What belt has he got?
In the photo?
Yeah.
That one I think is just I'm not even sure. I don't know if that's the Smoky Mountain. I think that's Smoky Mountain. It's not the U.S. tag straps from the NWA.
No, I don't recognize them as that. So it was unfamiliar to me. So I would believe that too. And wow, just that satin jacket. And he always had the power mullet. That was the other thing that,
But he made it work. I want to read something from my notes. Bobby Eaton's big break came in the fall, around September 1983, when Bill Watts was booking Swap Talent with Jerry Jarrett's Tennessee promotion. Now, Jerry Jarrett took over from Nick Goulas, and so in swapping talent, he brought in Dennis Condrey and Bobby Eaton. They were, just recognized as underutilized good hands to Bill Watts' Louisiana territory, still Mid-South, before it became the UWF. And they just didn't know what magic would follow. And Jim Cornette, soon was part of that whole package and was actually book on the fly right at ringside with Dennis Condrey and Bobby Eaton, which was very impressive. And he was known as the Motor Mouth then. Obviously, you remember him talking about his mama helping him along at being Jim Cornette, because Bobby Eaton was a very quiet, humble guy. And but those were the Dennis, with Dennis Condrey, those are the years with Norvell Austin, Porkchop Cash, Sputnik Monroe, and others. And, they were in the locker rooms and fighting with Rick Rude, the Barbarian, Jim Neidhart, before he, of course, went back to Calgary, and then Vince brought him in to WWF. And the phrase Midnight Express had been used before in wrestling, obviously not in reference to that movie, the drug movie of the same name, but
although they did use the same theme.
Yeah, they capitalized on the theme, and then they had to, for legal reasons, alter it and have a version that I think fans like better than the actual movie soundtrack they were using as their entrance music. But the original Midnights were a three-man group of Dennis Condrey, Norvell Austin, and Randy Rose. And they primarily were working in Alabama and Tennessee from 81 to 83. People came and went in and amongst that team, so it wasn't just Condrey.
So maybe it was Randy Rose, not Doug Summers.
Yeah, you're right. It was Randy Rose when Heyman brought him in. But, I mean, that really kind of wasn't the original Midnight Express, but that's how they were billed. And, they won championship after championship, the NWA World Tag titles, the U.S. Tag titles, I believe in Smoky Mountain. They wrestled, they won belts from Mr. Wrestling 2 and Magnum TA, where they tarred and feathered Magnum TA in the process. They had the greatest feud of tag teams, in my opinion, against the Rock and Roll Express, but they equally had great matches with the Fab.
Yeah, it was really like you truly had like the black chess pieces and the white chess pieces facing each other. They were the dark side and the light side, with the Rock and Roll Express being the ultimate in faces, and the the Midnight Express being the ultimate in heels. And they were very equally matched physically, all four of them. So that got over very well.
But that tells you about heels, because there was no nicer person in wrestling. And he was in that group with Mick Foley.
All you had to do was show up with Jim Cornette. You're automatically a heel. All you had to do was show up with Jim Cornette or Paul Heyman.
Yeah, it's that established. But Corny wasn't originally there with them when they were, over big time, the original triad that had other members coming and going. So it wasn't just those guys. But when he went out on his own, he was Robert Eaton and then the Earl of Eaton. He became British with Lord Stephen Regal and Bill Dundee, his father-in-law, as the sort of manager. But he also won the tag straps with Arn Anderson, and then he feuded with Arn, two of the greatest wrestlers of that era. Those matches were just unbelievable. But as a tag team, I loved them as well. And Eaton and Condrey, Eaton and Lane, they could have matches with anybody, whether...
Yes.
Any team, the Road Warriors, Tully and Arn, anybody, and always unique matches. And that was the thing, the pride of Jim Cornette and the Midnight Express, with Jim Cornette planning these little things by the second at ringside, was their matches were never the same.
NWA Saturday Night had one match, I was talking last week, between Bobby Eaton and Ric Flair. And I think it was a 45-minute draw, 30 or 45-minute draw. And it was probably the best match I've ever seen on TV, at least for the NWA. I think it was the greatest match the NWA ever put on TV. It was
it's a shame that odd match. They were trying to promote initially early on after some tag success. Scott Steiner had that match with Flair. It was supposed to elevate him as a singles. he was just a little too young, and maybe he was a bit nervous. He didn't quite live up to the hype. And I thought, as you did, that the Flair match with Eaton was far better on the same show, about the same period of time. It was an amazing match, two guys in their prime. And that's what we always got from Bobby Eaton. He never slacked. I mean, you can't say you ever saw a match of Bobby Eaton's. It wasn't terrific.
No.
Did you like to watch? And I can't say that.
And I watched a lot of his matches too. I pretty much watched his whole career, and no, he always gave it his all. He gave it in front of the tiny studio audiences that he used to wrestle in front of with 30 or 40 people or 60 people, and then he would give it all when he was wrestling in front of 20, 30,000.
Well, people like Busted Open mentioned last week, they got to see rock and roll and Midnight's outdoors, the Meadowlands, I think it was, or maybe that was an indoor venue in New York when the NWA started touring up there, and then with Pro Wrestling USA, that kind of ill-fated but great attempted mix of the AWA and NWA. And the place, I thought I heard them say the crowd was an estimated or alleged 25,000, and they were like the co-main event, Midnight's Rock and Roll Express, or the main event, actually. I think they were the main event. And people went out of their minds because they weren't used to seeing that caliber of tag team professional wrestling at its finest. And that's what Bobby Eaton was a part of.
You might never see that again. You know, that might be the highest point of tag team wrestling.
Well, for that era, things are different. It's hard. You can't compare Penta El Cerro and Phoenix, the kind of stuff that they're doing now. You just can't compare it. It's a whole different thing. Athletically and move, skill set, all of that stuff. But I was just going to say, all of the guys that we're paying tribute here to all gave their all, from Jody Hamilton, Masked Assassin, the Masked Assassin #1, even though #2, his tag partner, original tag partner, and was Tom Ernesto. But he also had other guys. He had on, the ridiculous thing is the announcers would get confused when they'd see at that time the newest Assassin #2 in Hercules under a mask. How could you confuse huge Jody Hamilton with, muscled up Hercules, or Jody Hamilton's ref son, Nick Patrick, way taller, slender, or some of the other people that worked as Masked Assassin #2.
As soon as you put on a mask, they forget who you were. Well, anyway, no, that's a very fitting tribute to the men that you knew, and we're at the end of our hour here. This has been another quick hour, and really appreciate it. We give our regards to Evan, who hopefully will be joining us after next month, and
drag it back in September. But again, R.I.P. to these three incredible legends: Jody Hamilton, beautiful Eaton, Dominic DeNucci. These were amongst the class Hall of Famers, and we're all, I can speak for all of wrestling, I hope I can, all miss them terribly. And this was around the world. These were global legends.
Very much so, and they changed the way we view wrestling today, and probably will for the future.
All right, everybody. Combate Kurosai.
Thank you very much for joining us this week, and we'll see you all next week. Thank you, everybody. Good night.